to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Thomas Schmidinger, who teaches at the University of Kurdistan, and he's also an occasional lecturer at the University of Vienna. We'll be talking about some of the general trends that we have seen in Syria since the downfall of Assad, about his specialty, which is Rojava, and also about the trends, conflicts, and tensions around the Sweden area. We've been hearing about that increasingly more over the past few weeks, and we'll figure out what's going on there and why a lot of it has been, let's just say, covered in a very ad hoc manner. But it's worthwhile seeing what the trends are, who are the people living there, and why there are conflicts going on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Before we get started, could you tell us a little bit more about your work and how you got involved in this area?
Well, I was always interested, even before I studied political science, in the region, and I met some Kurds already when I was a teenager in my home region, a Kurdish immigrant in Austria. And now I'm teaching at the University of Kurdistan Hawler in Erbil, half of the year, the other half in Vienna. And my main focus is on Syria and Iraq, not only on the Kurdish question, but these parts of Kurdistan. I know some Arabic, but not that much Turkish and Persian. That's why it's logic that I'm mainly focusing on these parts of Kurdistan. And in the last years, I did a lot of field work also in Syria, mainly in Rojava, but not only in Rojava. So I guess this is the reason why you invited me to talk with you about Syria.
Yes, exactly. I read your comment on Facebook and I thought this is a very good overview for people who are confused by what's happening. And indeed, while people have been keeping an eye on Syria since Assad's overthrow, they have not necessarily been paying long-term attention about the various minority groups there, the relations between people, or for that matter, what even the new government is doing. And
Well, I traveled to Syria the first time in 1999 when Hafez al-Assad was still alive. So I follow up with the region quite a while.
A lot of the things that we have been discussing, the way they're covered in the media has been very, very let's just say reactionary to the events and not very much explaining who is involved, why, and what's happening. I kind of wanted to talk about some of the trends that are pointing to the potential trajectory of domestic fragmentation, especially in light of the fact that Sweden has been in the news a lot lately, and there's been incidents of violence, but they are not new. They haven't just happened in the last few weeks. There's actually been some level of tensions going on from the entire from the moment the Syrian Unity Government formed. So I kind of want to ask you, how do you interpret this trend of growing violence in that area within the broader context of Syria's post-conflict fragmentation that's still ongoing to this day, despite or maybe because of government's efforts?
Well, the question is if we are in a post-conflict situation or if we're not just in a kind of intermediate period between two transnational armed conflicts. I would rather call it a transnational conflict than a civil war already, because relatively soon after the civil war started, other players of the region became involved. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia. Now also Israel is involved, of course. So it's not just an internal division and an internal conflict of Syria. It's a transnational conflict where regional armed and political actors within Syria are connected to larger interests, to states from outside. So it's a very complex interwoven situation between very local conflicts, between conflicts within Syria and regional and global conflicts. That was actually the case at least since 2012, 2013. Also, some of the actors within Syria are part of a larger political movement. I mean, the best known case was ISIS, of course, because it established a state-like entity on both sides of the Sykes-Picot border in Iraq and Syria. But also the Kurdish movement is part of a larger Kurdish movement, and to a certain degree, also the Druze actors now in the south of Syria are at least linked to other Druze movements, not to talk about the transitional government of Ahmed al-Shara that is strongly supported and also depending on Turkey. So there are a lot of interests from outside of Syria that are involved in the whole conflict situation. The new transitional government under Ahmed al-Shara was never in control of the whole Syrian territory. And they were also not the dominant military and political force that took over Damascus in December 2024. They were a relatively strong player, and they managed, with the support of Turkey, but not only with the support of Turkey, also to a certain degree with American, British, and European support, to take over the formal institutions of the Syrian state, but they never managed to take over the whole territory of Syria. So even within the coalition that overthrew finally Bashar al-Assad, the fraction of Ahmed al-Shara, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was only a part of it. Yeah? Keep in mind, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the jihadi or post-jihadi organization of Ahmed al-Shara, had about 40,000 armed men in December 2024, while the Syrian Democratic Forces, the military alliance led by the Kurds, had about 120,000 fighters. And the pro-Turkish proxies of the so-called Syrian National Army, that are also divided in different fractions, had about 80,000 fighters. The territories in the south now that are inhabited predominantly, but not solely, by Druze, never were under control of the transitional government. These territories were taken over by Druze militias. There are also different Druze militias with partly different interests and position towards the transitional government, and different religious and political leaders of the Druze in the Jebel Druze region around Suwaida in the south of Syria. But in general, the security forces of the new transitional government that are still strongly dominated by previous jihadi Islamist groups never were present in Suwaida and the Druze inhabited territories. But there were a lot of local issues between some of these Druze militias and the Sunni neighbors of the Druze inhabitants of the region. These Sunni neighbors are partly Bedouins, especially when it comes to the east of Jebel Druze. We're approaching more or less a desert-like region there, but also the settled Sunni Arabs between the Jebel Druze and the Golan Heights. In these territories, Sunni Islamist militias were relatively strong, and at the beginning of the civil war, talking now about 2013, 2014, there were also activities of ISIS and other jihadi groups in the region that controlled partly also territories that were close to the Golan Heights and attacked the Druze because of their ideology that the Druze are apostates of Islam. That's their interpretation of the Druze religion. So these attacks from jihadi and Islamist militias led to the fact that during the civil war, a part of the Druze allied with the regime in Damascus, and the regime in Damascus actually armed some local Druze militias. However, those militias at the end of the day were not completely loyal to Bashar al-Assad, but mainly loyal to their fellow Druze. And whenever one of these militias became too independent from Damascus, mysteriously one of the leaders died, for example. The most famous case is for sure Wahid al-Balous, the leader of the so-called Men of Dignity militia that was most probably killed by the regime. So with time, those militias became more and more distant to the Syrian regime, and also a part of the religious leadership became more and more distant to the regime. And in 2023, a mass movement started, a civilian movement that was not armed, in Suwaida, that started to protest against the regime. So after the beginning of the protests against the regime in 2011, this was the first civilian protest against the Syrian regime. And Suwaida actually, it became more and more difficult for the regime to control Druze territories around Suwaida. And those people who became now the Druze leaders actually got much of their merits during this period between 2023 and 2024, when they became also political leaders of this civilian movement, especially Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, who became also a known figure in the news in the last days, is one of the three most important religious sheikhs. There are three rival sheikhs to a certain degree of the religious establishment of the Druze in Syria. And he played a very important role as a religious leader for this civilian protest movement in 23 and 24, but also an integrative figure that tried to somehow mediate between different Druze fractions and bring them together within the Jebel Druze region. There are two other important leaders with slightly different positions. Hamoud al-Hinawi, another sheikh who also lately joined this protest movement against the regime. But there was one important sheikh, Yusuf al-Jarbu, who actually was loyal until the end to Bashar al-Assad. And in this configuration of different positions during the previous civil war, and the relationship of these different Druze fractions with the neighboring Sunni rebel groups, every spark can light a fire, say it like that. And the whole disaster of the last week actually started with some Bedouin Sunni militias stealing a transport car with vegetables of the Druze, and then both sides started to take hostages of each other. The big problem actually arises that in such a a confessionalized situation, this very easily leads to a confessionalized violence. And the Druze already felt very much sidelined by the new Syrian transitional government that is still led by previous jihadis of Ahmed al-Shara and those people who were around him. So when a Sunni militia that is partly at least allied with these Sunni Islamist groups attacks Druze inhabitants, of course the Druze do not see that as a local conflict about interest. They see it as a Sunni Islamist attack on the Druze for confessional reasons. So this is why this whole conflict became within a few days a kind of confessionalized conflict between Sunni Islamists and the Druze population. And the thing got even worse when Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri asked for help. And he asked the Jordanian king, the Saudi king, the US President Trump, but also the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for help. And in the Syrian context, of course, especially the call for help to Netanyahu was seen by many Sunni Islamists as a kind of high treason. And those who didn't want to hear that he also applied to Saudi Arabia and to Jordan only heard the call for help to Israel. And this sparked now also again anti-Druze resentment. We do not know that much about the details, what really happened. It seems that there was violence from both sides, but of course the Druze were much weaker in this situation. And many of the about 900 casualties were Druze, including Druze civilians. There were also casualties within the Christian minority in the region. There was one church destroyed and vandalized. There was an evangelical priest killed. So the perception of the events of the last days, not only by Druze, but by other religious minorities in Syria, is that this is a sectarian violence of Sunni Islamists against a religious minority. And I fear that combined with what happened in March against the Alawites, this could sustainably destroy the remaining minimal trust that is needed into the security forces, because when the government actually sent security forces of the government to Sueda, these security forces completely failed to play a neutral role and to intermediate between the Bedouin Islamist militias and the Druze militias. What they did is actually that they joined the Sunni Islamists. So although we still do not know exactly who committed what crime exactly in the region, that still needs serious investigations, I think. We definitely can say that the perception of what happened is that there was a Sunni Islamist massacre against the Druze. This is the narrative of the Druze and the Alawites and many other minorities in Syria, while many, not all, of the Sunni Syrians, especially those who support the government, perceive what happened as an act of high treason of Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, and further on of the Druze minority, that they became something like the fifth column of Israel. Keep in mind that Israel has some small but strategically important territories occupied, additionally occupied to the Golan Heights after the fall of the regime. So there is already this tension with Israel, although Ahmed al-Shara tried to play it down and tried to be relatively friendly towards Israel. So the situation is very, it's a multi-layered conflict. And I fear that actually this might be now, let's say the next 2 weeks or so, might be the last chance to really change the transitional government and to come back to the negotiation table and to include the ethnic and religious minorities with significant positions, not just with one minister for higher education in the transitional government, and also to open a dialogue that at least is open to a solution that would be also some kind of decentralization or federalization of Syria. So this idea that Syria has to be a centralist state that is the same idea that the Baathists had. This actually destroyed the trust of the Kurds. It destroyed the trust of the religious minorities, the Alawites, the Druze especially, but it also means that at the end of the day, it's very much likely that the civil war will continue because the new regime will not be able to conquer all these minority territories, at least not from one day to another and without military assistance. I mean, it's possible that Turkey helps them to conquer north and east Syria, but without this help, we will just face another round of civil war without any outcome within the next months.
Now, the elephant in the room has been whether all of this is just mostly a byproduct of sectarian engineering and sectarian tensions, or whether the Syrian unity government has directed at least some of the violence. How do we even begin to evaluate this question?
Well, it seems that it started as a local conflict, but keep in mind, if you have this local conflict between two very different sectarian groups with very different ideologies. And the Druze generally are one of the secular, very educated communities of Syria. Many Druze lived a while abroad. There's a huge Druze community in Venezuela, for example. Even Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri was born there. So they are also richer than the Bedouins. And then you have this impoverished Sunni Bedouin tribes who, partly at least, were very close to Islamist and jihadi groups, and who saw a chance to just drop some of the more richer Druze in Sueda. So it's partly also a kind of social conflict. So these different layers together are a very explosive thing. And then if you send security forces to this region, security forces where you know already that at least a huge part of these forces are ideologically very close to one of the two conflict parties, Sunni Islamist Bedouin faction, let's say it like that, then you either intend that they help one of the two sides, or you are too stupid to realize that this will just cause a massacre. I think actually that the government in Damascus, but I just have some indications, don't have any proof for it. The government in Damascus just saw the chance to extend its influence to Sueda and they already had several attempts actually to find a deal that the general security at least comes to the provincial capital, Sueda. So they might have just seen the chance to gain influence in the region and to send uh, some units of the general security to Sueda. I don't think that Ahmed al-Shara intended to commit a massacre. I mean, this would be stupid from his perspective, and from his. I mean, he tries to behave as the nice guy since months, and after the massacre against the Alawites in March, he really tried to fix at least his image in the West. So for that, this massacre was a disaster. And also, if you want to regain sovereignty, if you want to prevent Israel to get further involved in Syria, then it's not smart at all to commit a massacre, because it would maybe justify further Israeli intervention. So I think Ahmed al-Shara and his government initially thought this could be an opportunity to take over, or to at least get a foot into Sueda, and then it went out of their hands, because these people are all, or most of them are people with a jihadi background, and when they see other Islamist militias fighting against a bunch of apostates from their perspective, it was very much likely that they join the Islamists, and I think this went out of the hand of the regime, but the regime realized it too late.
So, how do the mainstream Sunni Arabs view this situation? Because not much has been said about the general, perspective on this.
Well, you have to keep in mind that many Sunni Arabs are not Islamists at all. There were also Sunnis who were pretty fine with the Ba'ath regime, and there were also secular Sunni opposition groups, especially in these cities like Damascus or Aleppo. By far, not all Sunni Arabs sympathizes with Ahmed al-Shara, and I mean, Damascus was always a very secular city at the end of the day, and the bars where people drink alcohol in the Christian quarter of the old city were not just filled with Christians or Druze. There were also secular Sunnis going there to have a beer in the evening, and the lifestyle of many urban Sunnis was not that different than the lifestyle of some Sunni Arabs in Beirut, for example. So they also felt under threat when Ahmed al-Shara and those post-jihadi militias took over the country. However, we have to say that some of them were, like many of us, the observers of Syria, were positively surprised at the beginning, because the signals of Ahmed al-Shara and the regime were not just signals towards the West, but also signals towards their own population. Until now, you can drink a beer in the Christian quarter of Damascus. Until now, we don't have a gender segregation in schools. Until now, women can study at universities. Until now, you can see women without scarves, at least in the cities of Syria. The Christians could perfectly celebrate their Christmas also in public. There were Christmas trees everywhere. So Syria did not become Afghanistan. So Ahmed al-Shara did win at least partly the trust of some of these secularists. And many people I know from Syria, but also from the Syrian diaspora here, who are Sunni Arabs and who are secularists. I mean, we discuss these things over a beer. Said, well, I'm not a friend of him, but it seems that he tries to unify Syria. Let's give him a chance. Things like that. The first people who lost their hope in March when the massacre against the Alawites happened. Then I heard also some of the Sunni intellectuals really commenting on this. This doesn't go the right direction, but with the Alawites, you still could argue that this is somehow a revenge. Of course, not all Alawites were with the previous regime, but we know the presidential family was from the Alawite background. Many of the high-ranking military, the mukhabarat, so the secret services, all these people were, or many of these people were Alawites, and many of the Alawites in the villages were used by the regime to fight the Sunni opposition groups. So you could maybe still argue, okay, this was a kind of local revenge. But this is not the case anymore for the Druze. Druze did not play an important role in the security apparatus of the previous regime. It's not a revenge anymore. This is really just sectarian or sectarianized violence. And this is why I think the recent events were much more disastrous for the hope of these secularists of different ethnic and religious background, that Ahmed al-Shara would be able to mediate a new Syria that is somehow a little bit Sunni Islamist, but that allows enough space for all the other groups to breathe. I see that this hope is diminishing, and so I think also many of the Sunni Arabs who are secularists are really shocked about it.
So I'm going to ask a little bit of a provocative question. To what extent do you think the recent comments of Tom Barrack, the American special envoy to Syria and the ambassador to Turkey, calling for a centralized Syria with no, basically arguing against the decentralization model that Ahmed al-Shara promised at the beginning of his tenure, to what extent do you think they set the stage for what occurred? Do you think it was sort of a green light that either Shara himself or his underlings interpreted as a justification for
yes,
for the use of violence?
I think you're right. It was at least interpreted as a green light, and also in north and east Syria. I mean, I'm in permanent contact with some friends, intellectuals there. This was interpreted that way, that Tom Barrack sided with, and through Tom Barrack, the United States sided with Ahmed al-Shara and gave him a green light to establish a centralized Syrian state, even if it is made by force. And even before the events in Sueda, people in northeast Syria became increasingly worried that this would maybe be a green light for Ahmed al-Shara to conquer northeast Syria with the support of the Turkish army. Because without the Turkish army, it will not work. But with the Turkish army, especially with the Turkish Air Force, it would be possible to destroy northern Syria. So, yes, I think the comments of Tom Barrack encouraged the regime to try to get back, or try to get in control of Sueda.
Now, at one point, everyone expected Syria to become sort of a federated state with autonomous regions. The more, farther from Damascus and the more sectarian, the more autonomous. Would that model have actually worked had there been a serious effort to implement it? Or do you think this is unrealistic given the level of sectarianism and distrust to the central authorities that we are seeing among some of the non-Sunni Arab residents of those regions?
Well, Ahmed al-Shara said from the beginning on that he's definitely against federalism.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is in the Middle East, nearly nobody understands what federalism means.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the people have in mind the dysfunctional model of Iraq that actually means that the Kurds are more or less de facto independent, but the Iraqi state doesn't function at all. I think, or my experiences when I talk about federalism with Syrians, that at the beginning most of the Sunni Arabs are absolutely no way. Yeah, that's centralized Syria is everything else. This is a red line. But then when I come up with some examples and tell them, listen, Switzerland is a federal state, Germany is a federal state, the United States are a federal state. So there are also federal states that actually work, and federalism does not mean separatism. Then a dialogue is possible. So I think we really would have to talk about what kind of federalism should be. What I cannot imagine is that a kind of asymmetrical federalism would work. Yeah? Because this would be exactly the dysfunctional Iraqi model. So a centralized state for half of Syria and de facto independence or de facto regimes with formally autonomy for the Kurds, for the Druze, and the Alawites. I think this would not lead to a stability of Syria. But what would lead to a stability of Syria is really a model like Switzerland, that you have a symmetrical federalism with different cantons, federal states, however you call it.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these federal states would be predominantly Sunni Arab. One of them would be predominantly Druze. One of them would be predominantly Alawite. Maybe three of them would be Kurdish, two of them mainly Kurdish, one of them Kurdish, Arab, Assyrian, Christian mixed. And if we take Switzerland as an example, we could even implement very small regions. In Switzerland, they have cantons and half cantons. Mm-hmm. So maybe why not even a small regional autonomy in the Wadi al-Nasara for the Syriac Christians there, and in Ma'lula for the three villages that speak Western Aramaic, and in Kasab for the Armenians. This would be all possible, I think. And what is also very important is that federalism does not just mean that that's not just on one level. In the Middle East, in many countries, including Syria, we have a big problem with the lack of subsidiarity on the local level. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So to elect mayors and municipalities that manage local politics, that would be also extremely important. So we really would have to have a conversation about decentralizing Syria as a whole. Mm-hmm. And we would need to convince also Sunni Arabs that they might gain something from that if they can elect their local municipalities and they can elect their local canton councils or whatever as well. And that federalism is not just something for the minorities, but also for the majority. I think this would be the necessary conversation. For me, it's not a question of what I would like or what certain Syrians would like. I think after the recent events, actually federalism would be the only way to perceive the national unity of Syria. So if you want to keep Syria as a state together, then I don't see another chance than a federal Syria. Otherwise, you have to fight this war until one of the sides wins, and this would mean another years of war with a lot of human atrocities. Or the other option is that actually the neighboring countries would to a certain reinstall puppet states. I mean, that's the danger at the moment, I think, that maybe Turkey installs a puppet state in the north of Syria, maybe Israel installs a puppet state on the Jebel Druze, and then Syria is not Syria. So if this would be my appeal towards these Syrian nationalists, if you want to keep Syria as a state, then you have to compromise, and you have to find a way that also the different minorities feel safe in the state. And the only way to do that is in a federal system. Otherwise, I fear that Syria will not exist anymore the way we know.
Now, given Syria's history, the whole situation with how the French and the British fighting over the future of the Middle East basically created fictitious states out of tribal territories, with Kurds, of course, being left out, in the cold in that process. Do you think keeping Syria as is really the best solution at this point in time? Should its borders be renegotiated? Is Turkey ever going to let any sort of autonomy for Kurds and others exist, given its alleged, security claims or territorial claims or expansionist policies, whatever you want to call it? I mean, is that something that's even possible to, or is it doomed to continuous sectarian fighting, given the fact that you can neither completely control the entire country nor rearrange it in a way that would have made sense 100 years ago?
I understand what you mean. The problem is, I mean, I don't think borders have to stay entirely the way they are today, but I think if you would split Syria, you would have more atrocities than if you would find a modus vivendi between the different groups. And let's go through some examples. Why? The Kurds are much better off within Syria with a relatively weak and maybe even one day democratic government than as a colony of Turkey that does not recognize Kurdish rights at all. The Armenians fled from Turkey. They are the survivors of the genocide of 1915. If this small region next to Antakya, where there are still Armenian villages around Kasab, if this would become Turkish territory, it would happen exactly what happened when Turkey took over Antakya in 1938. All these Armenians would flee. If a kind of Turkish-controlled Sunni state led or would be created in the north of Syria, the Christians from there they would have no chance. So there are so many small minorities besides these bigger ones. The Ismailis, there are even two different branches of Ismailis. There is a Yazidi minority in Afrin that was partly already displaced in 2018 when Turkey took over Afrin. There are also some Yazidis in the Jazeera region. So there are so many small minorities, and they are not all living in a certain place. They're also distributed through territories here. That at the end of the day, I think this would be much worse for the smaller minorities, the different Christian groups, for example, and it would be also a disaster for secular families who are predominantly citizens of Damascus, not a member of a sect or a tribe. So I think a federal Syrian state would be better than a division of Syria into different local tribal principalities or whatever. And it would also create at least a chance for a democratization, because why are Lebanon and Iraq more democratic than many other Arab? Because there's no group who is strong enough to oppress all the others. Yeah, maybe not completely democratic, but they're at least pluralistic. Different groups have to find some kind of compromise. And this might be the nucleus of a democratization. So if you have only one group in a local state led, this would not be the case. So I think a federal Syria would be definitely the better option than a division. And I think most of the Syrians think the same. I do not know a lot, even not a lot of Kurds who would say we want a separation of North and East Syria. And none of the leaders of the Druze militias, nor any of the Druze religious leaders asked for a Druze state in the Jebel. Even Hikmet al-Hijri, who desperately asked for help and who was desperately enough to even ask Benjamin Netanyahu for help, didn't ask for the establishment of a Druze state. So I think the majority of the Syrians still want to live together in the Syrian state. The question is how and how to organize.
So this is where I come to another sensitive issue that few have been commenting on in any depth. The Israeli airstrikes. To what extent have they been justified, and to what extent have they been effective? Now, we both probably have seen horrific images of massacres. So from a human rights intervention perspective, I would say that absolutely some sort of a intervention from somebody was justified to put a stop to the violence, given that the government either was unwilling or unable to quickly put an end once things started getting out of hand and it became obvious that this is not a fight between equals but a massacre of civilians and so forth. But to what extent Israeli attacking military targets and symbolic targets in Damascus was really going to put an end to these internal processes? To what extent it disrupted the peace talks with Damascus that Israel was pursuing, and was it really effective in convincing Sharar or that he needs to do something different, and can he do something different in that sense? So is it just going to piss off a lot of people in Syria who are not necessarily sympathetic to foreign interventions? What how is this situation being viewed?
Yeah, I think there are also different levels we have to talk about. I mean, there's the level of international law, there it was not justified. There's the level of humanitarian intervention. Yes, if there was really the danger of a genocidal situation, then of course an
Was
intervention.
there?
Sorry?
Was there? That's the question.
That's the question. I'm not sure about it, you know. I
Because
think
I am hearing that the Jews were convinced that there was some sort of a planned massacre in the works, but
yes,
there are conflicting intelligence sources.
yes,
Some are
absolutely.
saying that this was fictionalized, exaggerated, or or simply just misperceived.
Absolutely. And that's why I, as a scholar, I have to be careful, and I can also not tell with the knowledge I have today that
Mm-hmm.
this was the beginning of a genocide and the Israelis stopped. This is something I could not say at the moment.
Sure.
We need more knowledge about it. The problem is, even if it would have helped to stop that on the short term,
Mm-hmm.
it might have harmed more on the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is really that the intervention was an Israeli one. So if the Jordanians or
Mm-hmm.
as I said, he asked also the Saudi king, the Jordanian king, or the American. Yeah.
Let's face it, those countries, with the exception of the US, were never going to do anything.
Yes,
Please.
but the US could have done. Yeah.
Right.
So, uh, so it would have been, of course, better if somebody else would have done it than the Israelis. Yeah? Now the problem is really that Sunni Islamists, and not just the jihad, many Sunnis in Syria see the Druze as traitors, and the problem, I mean, it has also an internal thing in Israel. Because people there also know that the Druze in Israel have a very different position. I mean, we know that there are two groups of Druze in Israel, the ones on the Golan Heights, who were always mostly loyal towards Syria, but the Druze in the core land of Israel, especially in the Carmel mountain near Haifa and in Galilee, they are very loyal citizens of Israel. They are in the security apparatuses of Israel. They are in the military of Israel, and also keep in mind what time we are talking about. Yeah, we're talking about a moment where Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza. Yeah, we can discuss to what extent and how justified whatever is in Gaza, but from the Arab perspective, it's clear that Israel is committing a genocide. I personally do not use this term for what is going on in Gaza, but this is at least the perception in the Arab world. Yeah? So everybody who works with Israel at the moment uh, is seen as a traitor and somebody who collaborates with a genocidal regime in Israel. Yeah? So on the long run, this could have harmed the Druze more than it could have helped them. It's a dilemma. If I'm really convinced that I'm facing a genocide myself, like so if the Druze, if Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijr thought they're coming to us to massacre us in the way ISIS massacred the Yazidis, then of course you ask for help from anybody that is willing to help you. Because if somebody wants to kill you, I'm thankful if the worst killer himself saves me life. Yeah? But on the same time, if this makes me more vulnerable in the future, this of course means a disaster for the future relationship of the Druze and the leadership of the Druze with the politicians of Syria. So I think it was really a dilemma for the Druze to choose between two very bad alternatives, and it would have been way better if the Americans, instead of supporting the centralism in Syria, would have just spoken something. Maybe it would have been enough if Trump would have said stop. Maybe this would have been enough. Especially if the Americans and the British are also very influential on Ahmed al-Sham. There are some British people who are his advisors. So if the UK and the US would have clearly said stop, It would have maybe had the same effect than the Israeli bombardment, but without the negative midterm and long term.
So here's a question that again gets a little complicated. Now, Israel in intervening was pursuing several obvious goals. One was clearly humanitarian intervention. One was its own border security question. It established a doctrine of not having any Syrian forces near the borders. But the third message, broader message beyond these tactical considerations, was about its general concern about the Al-Shara/Turkey um, alliance that it believes to be a potential strategic threat equal to Iran. And at the same time, it was also trying to pursue some security or peace talks with Damascus. Obviously, that was now disrupted. To what extent this mixed messaging and this longer term strategic goals do you think harmed any tactical benefit that Israel was pursuing? Because if Israel is being seen as automatically distrustful of Damascus and whoever is behind Damascus, if their goal is not, doesn't it undermine its credibility in saying it was a humanitarian intervention to save lives? Are they not in danger of being perceived as having already made up their mind about a potential regime change in Damascus and so not negotiating in good faith with al-Shara?
Well, at the moment, I think Israel has not a lot of chances to be seen as a vis-a-vis in good faith as long as this war in Gaza continues. I think any Arab leader who at the moment would normalize, how it is called in the Arab way, the relations to Israel, would be seen as a traitor. Yesterday we even had big, you have to cut that because it's not yesterday, sorry. We recently even had big demonstrations in Morocco against the Abraham Accord. So Morocco, that is relatively authoritarian ruled, there are not a lot of demonstrations against governmental policies. And there were huge demonstrations against the normalization with Israel. So I think without a lasting ceasefire in Gaza and some kind of political solution, any Arab government cannot go into a deal with Israel. Even keep in mind that the Saudi government was very close to signing the Abraham Accords before 7th of October.
I'm not sure about that. I'll be honest with you. My sources tell me that a lot of that was more of a play to get Biden to offer concessions, and it was not probably, yeah.
Maybe at least we can, not having your insights in Washington, yeah, but maybe, but at least the reason why Hamas did the 7th of October was partly to distract
what they perceived to be a trajectory.
So and it worked to a certain degree. Yeah. So at the moment, no Arab country can normalize with Israel. So if Israel wants to have peace treaties with Syria, with Lebanon, which are the most important things, I think, at the moment, the other states are further away, then there must be a political solution for Gaza, and this war must be stopped. As long as hundreds of civilians are killed every day in Gaza, and as long as this is broadcasted on every TV station in the Arab world and every Arab sees there are another 100 people killed in Gaza, there's another massacre at one of these food distribution points, no government can risk to sign a peace treaty with Israel.
Now, given the optics, there's a lot of questions, not only from Israel, but even within the United States, as to why the Arab states, on the one hand, are concerned about Gaza, but on the other hand, have taken no steps to pressure al-Sharaa over the treatment of minorities in Syria. Because we have not heard from any of the Arab states in that regard, and we're not talking about military interventions, we're just talking about political pressure, economic pressure, and so forth.
Well, this criticism on the that Arab states have a different standard concerning criticizing Israel or Arab states. Yes, of course, that's true. And many of these Arab states, keep in mind, most of the Arab states are authoritarian ruled states with many minority issues themselves. If a state is strong enough to oppress his own minorities, then there are no atrocities needed. But the situation of minorities in many Arab states is not very comfortable. Let's say it like this. So, and then there's the other thing that also the Arab states, like Europe and the US and the UK, hoped that Ahmed al-Shara brings some stability to Syria. So if even the United States didn't say anything, encouraged the Syrian regime to take full control of territory, what do we expect from more or less authoritarian ruled Arab states who think it's normal to oppress minorities? I mean, yes, Israel claims to be a democratic state. And I think within its borders of 1948, so within the previous pre-1967 borders, Israel is a democratic state. And if you, so the measurement, how you should behave towards minorities of a democratic state is higher than the measurement of anyway authoritarian state. I think this is one of the reasons for this critical position. But of course, you're right. Arab states were always more silent when it comes to human rights violation against minorities in Arab states than in Israel. Yes.
So from a strategic point of view, we are seeing sort of an impasse here, because Israel, on the one hand, is never going to be not concerned, first of all, about its own security, as long as there is some sort of a chaos next door. And on the other hand, it also, for both strategic, moral, and other reasons, is going to be siding with the Jews and potentially some other minorities. But on the other hand, you have the United States, at least at the moment, that wants al-Sharaa, that has economic opportunities that it seeks to pursue in Syria. You have Saudis, Turkey, and others who've already substantially put their money where their mouth is in terms of supporting Syria. They invested a lot. You have the European Union that is also looking to balance a sort of humanitarian approach with an economic approach. They don't want to be left behind, as the US is very
Europeans want
aggressively.
to get rid of their Syrian refugees also. I think the main reason for Europe's
and 2 million Syrians have already returned to Syria. And we have, and another issue is US very quickly unraveled its sanctions, which may have contributed to the current situation as well. So you have this clash between this economic and strategic vision and sort of understanding between the US, the Arab states, and European Union, maybe for different reasons, but nevertheless, still on the same page. And on the other hand, Israel. How do you see this playing out in the long term? Is there going to be a clash of interests that is, to my view, as of now, unavoidable? Can they come to some sort of a political understanding to sort of create a framework and get Sharia to follow that framework, or do you think
Well,
such a
you know,
Mhm.
I'm not even sure if there is a common strategy towards Syria within Israel, not to
Mm,
talk about these different states. Because for Israel, uh, yes, there is definitely some sympathy for different reasons for the truth. But for Israel, both would be interesting to have a stable neighbor, but also
mhm,
to have an unstable neighbor. Because if
mhm,
Syria is fragmented,
mhm,
the Golan Heights, and the longer the Golan Heights are the Israeli control, the longer you create facts on the ground, and the longer you create the situation where future neighbors, whoever they are, have to accept that the Golan Heights are part of the Israeli territory.
mhm,
Because as we all know, the Golan Heights are, from the Israeli perspective, an annexed territory and not an occupied territory.
mhm,
While from the Syrian perspective and the international law perspective, they are still an occupied territory. So for Israel, also instability in Syria could be an advantage,
mhm,
especially if you want to expand your territory. Uh, so I think not even the security apparatus of Israel maybe have uh, a common strategy concerning Syria.
mhm,
Um, Not to talk about what you said, Israel, the US, Europe, and the Arab states. I would say the Arab states would be interested into restabilization of Syria. They want to keep Syria as a state. For Turkey, it would be also fine just to occupy the north of Syria. I'm sure you know that even at the beginning of the Turkish war against the war of Mustafa Kemal against the uh, victorious nations of World War One, there was something called the Milli Ittifaq, the plan to restore a Turkish state that included also the north of Syria and the previous Mosul Vilayet, so the north of Iraq. And from a Turkish perspective, this north of Syria and Iraq was always somehow a Turkish territory that should be regained. Yeah? So maybe Turkey would be fine to a deal with Israel, that Israel takes the south and Turkey takes the north of Syria. Yeah?
mhm.
Does that create stability? I don't think so. Does this create a situation where minorities have a more comfortable life than in a federal Syrian state? I don't think so either. Uh, but I think all these possibilities are on the table at the moment, and uh, none of them is none of them will happen without further atrocities. That's the disaster.
Now, there is turning more towards the situation of the north, and which you just mentioned, and the Kurds. Obviously, they would not do well, or would not be happy, at least, about any Turkish occupation. And we have seen already what happened over the last few years, when it's not like there is a uh, strong voice of confidence in Erdogan's treatment of civilians in those
Mhm.
groups. Now there's a question of SDF integration into the military forces, the various pros and cons. Now you have a lot of the Kurds sympathetic to the Jews and distrustful of al-Sharaa, especially after their own demands or expectations have not been met. And you have this issue of Kurdish civilians being essentially disappeared, mass arrested, and that's not something anyone speaks about, because it's quiet. It's not like a major massacre with the Alawites or major. It's not. It's an ongoing situation that's been ongoing when it's one person here, one person there. It's not like a major assault on a city. So where do they stand? Clearly, they don't like having ex-jihadists in power, but on the other hand, they're not strong enough to overthrow the government and contribute to a different model. What happens for them?
Yeah, they are definitely, as you said, they're very skeptical towards Ahmed al-Shara. However, it seems that the communication between Mazloum Abdi, the commander of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and Ahmed al-Shara somehow works.
Mm-hmm.
So between these two men, there is not a trust, but there's
Understanding.
an understanding that we can negotiate and we have to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what is somehow the small thing where both of them would agree is that they want to regain sovereignty for Syria. Ahmed al-Shara is a Turkish ally, but he's not a Turkish proxy other than the Syrian National Army. So I think there is still an open channel of negotiation between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that an integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces into the Syrian army would need also a fundamental change of the transitional government and the command structure. So if you want to really reunify these very different, or if you want to unify, it's not a reunification, these very different militias into one army, you need to make sure that also in the command structure, officers of Syrian Democratic Forces are included, and you need also to depoliticize the Ministry of Defense. So the Syrian Democratic Forces will never fight under the command of a jihadi. So this makes it very difficult, this integration. Mm-hmm. I could imagine that an integration would work if Ahmed al-Shara is willing to give up really a part of his power. Let's try to think positive. Yeah? If Ahmed al-Shara would say tomorrow, okay, I tried my best, but I failed to bring peace to Syria, let's sit together and think about a new transitional government. Instead of me being the president, we establish a kind of triumvirate with 3 people with a rotation of
His
the
model,
head.
basically.
Yeah, something like let's take Ilham Ahmed and Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri and me. We 3 are now the presidents. Huh? And we also distribute the ministries new. The Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Justice will not be in one hand. We keep the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense should get a Kurd from the SDF, and the Ministry of Justice at Rus, for example. And another important ministry goes to the Alawites. I'm not now talking about copying the Iraqi or the Lebanese model for a long term, because it's also dysfunctional. But for a transitional period, a really inclusive government that includes these minorities with important positions would change the framework. And what he also would need to say is, my red line is not federalism. My red line is separatism. I want to keep Syria together. But in what form? This is something we will negotiate. We can negotiate about everything. And let's start a new negotiation on equal footing. So if this would be something he would announce in the next days or weeks, then I still see a hope for Syria. If not, if he insists on a centralized Syria under his rule and under his terms and conditions, then we will go into the next round of Syria.
Now, do you see, despite this positive dynamic with Abdi, but that the latest the events in Soweto could be a precursor for a similar situation in Kurdish held territories, especially if SDF is not ultimately integrated.
Yes, but this will be much more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So without Turkish support, there's no way that the new Syrian army can take over north and east. They are about equally equipped. I mean, the Israelis destroyed the heavy weapons of the Syrian army, so they're not having a functional air force and things like that. And both together have maybe about equally 120,000 people. So it would be by far not an easy goal for the new Syrian army just to take over north and east here with uh, with with established political and military structure. It would be different if Turkey would join as well, and Turkey would play the air force, for example. Then it would be possible, but otherwise not. Until now, the Syrian army, the general security, not even took over the southern edge of the Euphrates River, where still local tribal militias control the territory.
Mm-hmm.
So this army, how it is now, will not be able to control whole Syria by force. And when you talk to people who traveled recently from Damascus, for example, to northeast Syria, they tell you that actually a few kilometers after Damascus is the last checkpoint of the regime, and then there's nothing because they don't have enough people to control even the territory they already have.
Mm.
So I don't see the ability of the new regime take over northeast Syria alone. But as I said, there's always the danger that Turkey supports this, and if the Americans give a green light to that, then of course this is possible. But this would mean not only a massacre; it would mean also that the new regime would have to be extremely oppressive for a long period. So then we have really a kind of new dictatorship.
I mean, that's one of the concerns that this is where the whole situation is going. But in terms of Turkey, they are going through this so-called peace process with the PK, with dismantling, disarming the PKK. I can't imagine ex-PKK fighters joining in on any oppression of Syrian northern territories. Why would they want to do that when when they've had a long-standing relationship? How would that work? That's also another conundrum here.
Yeah, no. To be honest, I do not really trust this so-called peace process at all. Yes, we have some very nice gestures from the side of the PKK, but what did come back from the Turkish state until now? Turkey is still bombarding PKK fighters in the north of Iraq, although they are already disarming themselves. So at the moment, this is a very one-sided thing where the PKK agreed to dissolve and to disarm, but Turkey is still a very aggressive military actor, even in the north of Iraq, not to talk about Syria. So at the moment, I do not see really an alliance between Turkey and the PKK coming up. This would be really far-fetched.
Yeah, I also don't see them actually taking part in that. Even if they somehow overcame that, I can't imagine them participating in any Syria-related campaigns.
Now, this would be seen as treason by many Kurds and would definitely lead to split. So this is something that is really not imaginable, I think.
Do you believe, is there any meaningful coordination between the Druze and Kurdish political actors, or competition for that matter, amidst, this conundrum? Do you see them forming some sort of a united front, or you see them as two different and with conflicting interests for that to happen?
Well, maybe not a united front, but they are allies. And
Mm-hmm.
not even only the Druze and the Kurds, but also the Alawites to a certain
Mm-hmm.
degree. And maybe some of the Christian and the Ismaili groups as well, uh, at least in the question of federalism. Yeah? So that's where they really can join. And what I know from my friends in North and East here is that actually that this was the attempt with the reintegration into Syria, that they tried to reach out to other Syrians, not only to minorities. For example, the Kurdish women movement tried to set up also branches in Damascus, in Aleppo, and tried to find new allies also with secular Sunni Arabs. And they did find them. So I think if this integration of North and East Syria into the state structures of Syria would work, uh, they would not be a weak political actor. They would have their allies in the ethnic and religious minorities, but also within the secular, progressive, left wing Sunni Arabs. So the such an integration would not be from the position of weakness.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm hearing some Syrian Kurds, and it may be just a handful, but still, I've been hearing some voices claim that Jews are actually Kurds. Now, obviously, ethnically speaking, this is.
There's a small background story. It's not the Druze, but there is one influential Druze family in Lebanon, Jumblat family.
Mhm.
And the Jumblat family is original Kurdish.
Ah.
They are descendants of Kurdish nobles from the region of Afrin and Aleppo, and moved to Lebanon from there about 200 years ago. And although, normally you can't become a Druze if you're not
Mhm.
Druze by birth. So I don't know how that happened, but it seems to be that some people are more
Converted to Druzism
they,
somehow.
they became Druze, and within Lebanese Druze, actually, this is well known that the Tumblats are latecomers who were originally Kurds. Uh, so this is
There's a
this.
conflation of one specific story with absolutely everything. I just hope it doesn't backfire because I can't imagine that the Jews would necessarily accept that narrative overall.
No, this is the small piece of truth in the big narrative. Yeah, but of course the Druze are as much Arabs than any other Arabs, and the Syrian Druze actually played a very important role in the during the colonial period for Arab nationalism. Yeah?
Hmm.
Just Sultan al-Outrage and the Druze were also always part of the more Arab nationalist parties actually in Syria. For example, there were Druze in the so-called Syrian Socialist National Party. There were Druze also in the Ba'ath Party. There were Druze who were Nasserites. So there's no doubt that the the Syrian Druze are Arabs, uh, but
Hmm.
uh, but they are Arabs who are adherents of a very distinctive religious tradition that is different from Sunni Islam, and some of the Druze even think that their religion is not Islamic at all. There are also discussions within the Druze community about their relationship to Islam. So they are a religious minority, but not an ethnic.
So that kind of also leads me to the last part of the discussion, which is the West. And, I don't see the Trump administration changing its position on these matters, at least not while Tom Barrack remains in that influential position advising the president on these matters. He's had very long-standing relationships with Turkey, Qatar. I don't see him changing his mind on that while
Yeah.
he's still there, unfortunately. But what about
Yeah,
Europe and
unfortunately, I agree with that. Yes.
what about Europe? Do you see them eventually starting to play a more active role? Because up until now, other Western countries, except for the US, have not taken a very strong
Mhm.
position on anything. And frankly, everyone has kind of left Syria to its own devices with the whole, other than economic, opportunity, seeing
Yeah.
it as a potential for economic opportunities. Would do they see will they allow chaos to continue the way it
Yeah,
did?
unfortunately, Europe never really had a united policy towards Syria, as it doesn't have a lot of united policies towards any international conflict.
Do you see France,
Uh,
for instance,
yeah,
becoming more
France has
involved?
there's a French policy towards Syria and there's a German policy towards Syria, and the German policy towards Syria is different than the French. Germany was traditionally always closer to Turkey and still is,
Mm-hmm.
while France, as the former colonial power in Syria, has with a huge Armenian diaspora, has a much more distant position towards Turkey and a more pro-Kurdish, pro-Armenian, pro-Christian position in Syria.
But yet Macron has welcomed Sharal and was in fact the first European leader to
Yeah,
do so.
that's true, but I think this is it was correct to talk to Shara. Yeah, they wanted to know who is that guy, and they
Mm-hmm.
wanted to give him a chance.
Sure.
But especially keeping in mind the French uh, religionophobia, yeah? The laïcité of France. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I have no doubt that France will not support a post-jihadi regime in Syria. Yeah?
Mm.
Uh, the problem, in my opinion, is primarily Germany with its strong connection to Turkey and its fear of refugees. And the consequence of the fear of refugees is not that they invest into a real stabilization of Syria. The consequence is that they are more or less doing what Erdogan tells them to do, because Erdogan always blackmails the European Union with more refugees to come to Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not very optimistic that the European Union as a whole can play a role in Syria in the next years and months. I'm slightly more optimistic concerning France, but what I would see is that in the influence of France in Syria is shrinking, and Britain and the US are still very strong. Uh, so I doubt that France alone will be able to save Syria. I would rather, if there is somebody whom I think that could play a positive role, it's rather the Arab states,
Mm.
because they at least want to have some stability. Yeah? Maybe not democracy, for sure not, but stability. They realize that Ahmed al-Shara and his centralist project is not able to provide this stability, then they might be able to force him to compromise. But I rather would trust Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Egypt than the European.
Now, here is the final, question, which is a bit of a doozy. I mean, we've seen Al-Shara has had to rely on foreign fighters, again, with a wink wink from the Trump administration,
Mm.
and some of them don't even speak Arabic. We've
Yeah.
seen Chechens getting captured, assaulted others. All
Chechens,
of
Uyghurs, Central Asians, everything.
yeah, and a lot of that is clearly A, destabilizing, and B, but opens the doors for ISIS and other terrorist organizations to make a resurgence, which the Arab states clearly do not want. Even if they're okay with the Islamists in power, they probably don't want terrorism next door to where
Yes,
they are. So
yes.
what do you see happening? Is there going to be a proxy war in Syria with Arab states eventually backing some more secular alternative to Al-Shabaab and Turkey
Could
continuing?
be. I mean, the problem you mentioned with the international fighters, international
Uh-huh,
volunteers, is a huge problem, and it's a huge number. We don't know exactly the number, but we're talking about thousands or 10,000 fighters.
mhm,
And these are highly ideologized fighters, very radicalized, and they don't have a lot to lose. And when you talk to Alawites, for example, they all say we were mainly afraid of these foreign fighters and not so much about the Syrians in the Syrian security apparatus. Uh, so, what to do with them is a big problem because even if Ahmed al-Shara would try to get rid of them, who takes these people? I mean, he could massacre them, but who wants to have these extremists back in his own country?
mhm.
So it's really a problem what to do with, I don't know, maybe 30,000 international jihadis in Syria.
I mean, some
Yeah,
of them have reportedly also received Syrian citizenship, which is another problem because
yeah,
it makes that even harder to expel them.
yes, of course, of course. So I don't see any solution for that.
We'll be facing another ISIS stand in 10 years from now if Sharwa survives in his personal capacity that long.
Yeah, we will see, but this is a serious problem. What to do with these people?
Hmm.
And yes, you're right. The Arab states do not like to see these people maybe even traveling further
Hmm.
to Libya, to Sudan. Who knows? Yeah, this jihadi, the hijra can continue. So this is definitely a security threat uh, that countries like Saudi Arabia or Jordan want to prevent. Um, the problem is you need to integrate the part of the Sunni Islamist groups in the future Syrian political system. Otherwise, the Syrian Islamists are part of the Syrian social fabric.
Hmm.
And it's not so easy to say these are the ones that can be integrated and these are the hopeless cases. Uh, but without compromises with a part of the former jihadis, you will not get a stability either.
Hmm.
And this is the really difficult task to find a framework where people who are not necessarily used to negotiate and to compromise uh, realize that only some kind of compromise can lead to a minimum on stability.
I mean, the only successful model of that so far that actually worked out more or less in the long term was the IRA. But
Yeah.
I don't really, but in the Muslim slash Arab world, I have not seen it. Sudan turned into a disaster. Afghanistan, you've got the Taliban that never,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, when you go a bit back into history, you find cases
Mm,
that were also somehow successful. I mean, Algeria was established by an armed insurgents group, and Algeria is a relatively stable country.
hmm.
Uh, Iraq is more stable than 20 years ago now. It's stabilizing, although it had a lot of different militias, Kurdish, Shiite, whatever. Yeah. So I would say it's not completely impossible that armed non-state actors integrate into a state structure and become part of a legitimized security apparatus. But it's not an easy go. It's something that needs effort and that needs politicians and leaders who are willing to compromise.
Unfortunately,
Lebanon is an example. Lebanon. Lebanon is not at the moment. It's quite a disaster, but after the civil war in Lebanon, they managed to rebuild some kind of state. And so I wouldn't say it's an impossible task, but it's a difficult task.
well, at this point, I think we're still at a sort of impasse, and it's very unclear where things will go after the Syrian government announced, a ceasefire with the Druze. We have seen that there's been other flare-ups since then, and who knows how many we will see in the future. Meanwhile, there are other human rights issues that are not being addressed, not the Kurdish disappearance, not the sexual enslavement of our white women that's been reported, but has not become a major human rights issue in the media or on anyone's radar. All of these trends are deeply disturbing. I don't see Shara having either the tools or the motivation to really take care of everything, and even if he can take care of some things, others, his reach is not that.
Yes, but I think it's rather the tools than the willingness. Because yes, he's a former jihadi, but he definitely wants to rule Syria, and therefore he needs to be. Yeah. But keep in mind that it's really difficult to control his own people. This is a very diverse bunch of radicalized fighters who went through years of war, and he has to somehow also satisfy his own supporters. So this balance between trying to find a compromise with Kurds and Druze and other minorities, and to satisfy your own radicalized supporters, so that they do not start to fight you, is a very, very difficult task. So I'm not trying to defend Ahmed al-Shara here, but he's himself in a very precarious situation, caught between his own radicalized supporters and the necessity to compromise with groups that these people think are apostates and traitors and should be killed anyway.
Wow. A lot to think about for sure. I hope that even if Trump supports the centralization of Syria and so forth, he will at least realize that it's in his best interest to prevent destabilization through clashes, violence, and to prevent terrorism from spreading, which would mean that he would need to provide the Syrian government with those tools and with some sort of a political support to handle the juridicalization of these individuals and some sort of an integration path that doesn't involve letting them run amok and do whatever they want without any control. I think at the very least, even if ideologically there's Trump would have to understand that it's in his own interest, for the sake of his own economic ambitions in Syria, that there should be a stable environment without clashes and so forth. So let's hope that's one long-term outcome. For now, thank you so much for sharing these insights and for clarifying a lot of things that honestly have been coming out very jumbled among all the narratives, information warfare, random videos, and a lot of very emotional, but not necessarily consistent coverage of these events. And let's hope for a much better future, a much more peaceful future with a much more harmony among everyone who lives in Syria and within the region as well.
Let's hope so. Thank you.
Have a good evening, and everyone watching us, we'll be back Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as usual. Thanks for joining us tonight. Have a great night.